Hello, pianists, teachers, colleagues, and friends. Today we're talking about how to teach song, sometimes titled A Little Song, by Dmitri Kabalevsky. This is Opus 27, number 2, and it sounds like this. If we haven't met before, my name is Jana Williamson, and welcome to my home piano studio in the suburbs of Chicago. Kabalevsky is one of my favorite composers for students, and to that end, I recently gave a workshop to my Patreon partners called Kabalevsky and Friends, where we did an overview of all of his works for students and dove into some other issues around editions and teaching Kabalevsky. If you'd like to check out that workshop, please do click the link in the description of this video. Because of that workshop, I purchased a few newer editions of Kabalevsky, and one of those books is this one. It's the Kabalevsky Selected Piano Pieces, which comes in multiple volumes. This is the elementary to upper elementary level, and I would qualify this piece as upper elementary. There's some lovely introductory material at the beginning of this book, and one thing that Richard Walters, the editor, says is that Kabalevsky identifies 3 archetypes as basic musical forms, which all of the larger forms are generated and which are most accessible to children. And those are song, dance, and march. And once I read that, I thought, yes, all of Kabalevsky's music for students does fall into one of those categories. He also writes in a neoclassical style, so you get these, neoclassical forms. But obviously the piece that we are talking about today is a song, and it is just simply a song. We have a lovely melody accompanied mostly by thirds. And one of my favorite parts about this piece is that the melody trades off. While it's in the right hand for 75% of the time, the left hand does get to play the melody in that second line. And so I think that's one reason this is a brilliant piece for students, is to practice the melody against the accompaniment, which the accompaniment does feel relatively contrapuntal, and then it's these moving thirds. But anyway, we have melody against accompaniment, and we get to try that out with both hand combinations, right hand melody, left hand accompaniment, and vice versa. We're in E minor, and so that melody is using E minor scale patterns. You don't have to really use the scale finger. You can simply go up the 5 fingers, but then you end up moving to the E on top. And the left hand has similar, starting on the C, lift and move. So, of course, shaping the melody beautifully and then listening for that melody to sing over the accompaniment is one of the things that is completely appropriate at this level to do with a student, which would be challenging for them, but this piece, it's actually doable because the accompaniment is relatively simple and slow moving. So let's talk about those parallel thirds. For students to effectively play thirds, they must have a taller finger or a more rounded hand shape. You just can't play thirds with notes striking simultaneously if your hand is flattened out, or at least I haven't figured out a way to do that. So I would strongly recommend that students work on having those strong first joints not collapsing and not, splaying out flat while they play this. And so again, this is a good etude in that way. And truthfully, so many of Kabalevsky's pieces for students are technical etudes in some way, even though they don't sound so much like technical etudes, like we might think of something like Hannon or Czerny. So back to those thirds, nice tall finger 3, a little bit of a wrist dip and lift up to then fall into the next third. And then the next one becomes a little problematic because of the tie, so they have to let that thumb rest on the G while the bottom note changes. Same thing for the right hand, tall fingers, lift, And then Richard Walters advocates for using 5 and 3 to start here, so that's even a little bit more difficult technically to then go to 4. You don't have to use that fingering. You could use 4 and 2, and then 3 and 1. I would probably use that because you can lift up. And then beautifully in the second half of the piece, we get this chromatic movement. So more of these black keys and white keys trading off. This is measure 11. So you can use the analogy with a student of, a spider walking across the keys, listening for both notes of the third to strike at exactly the same time. They can also listen. You could play those lines individually. Certainly taking into account which steps are half steps and which steps are whole steps. This is a great way to integrate theory with repertoire to really listen. When is it a half step? When is it a whole step? As well as make sure you're playing it accurately, because that part from measure 9 down to measure 14 is the most intricate, and it's easy for students to miss accidentals, or they might miss an F sharp from the key signature because they're thinking so much about the printed accidentals. So that is something to go over. For instance, at the end of measure 14, going from the G and the B to the F sharp, A sharp, students sometimes miss that F sharp because they're thinking about the A sharp on the top of the third. So with 20th century music, this is not that bizarre, but it is interesting. We as teachers have to hold our students accountable to playing accurately, and certainly when you send a student home with this in the first week, go over that left hand from measure 9 to the end. Make sure they understand what's happening there and that they're going to really pay attention to those accidentals and play accurately. Kabalevsky wrote very natural dynamics for this, shaping it up to the most interesting climactic part in measure 12 and then a subito piano in measure 13, which leads to the question of, what is this piece about? And since the title is vague, song, or in this book translated a little song, then you get to ask your student the question, what is this song about? If you were going to write lyrics, what would they be about? Is this about a small child who got lost, or an animal who has gotten lost? Is it about a breakup? Is it about a painful memory of some sort of loss? And depending on the age and developmental stage of your student, you could be as surfacey or as deep with your student as you want. One little thing, I find that sometimes students have a hard time coming up with something that they feel is their own feeling. So I don't like to ask questions like, how does this make you feel? Or what feeling are you having when you play this? Because it's just too close to home and they don't always know how to process it, particularly less mature students. So an easier way to get around that, I find, is asking them, if this were a story or if this were a scene in a movie, what would be happening? Who's the character? And then it's very easy for the character to feel sad or lonely or forlorn. Much easier for a character to feel that you're picturing in a film or thinking about writing a story about than for the student themselves to feel that, because they may not have felt a lot of grief in their life, particularly if they're a young student. And I just find that's a much easier way to work around. If they really have a hard time even entering that creatively, you can ask them, have you ever seen a movie or a show or read a book with a sad character? Or, something. If they say it sounds sad, then, and they still can come up with something creative, you can ask them that. And then students might be able to enter into, oh yes, Harry Potter was an orphan. He was very sad at how he was being treated. You can get into all kinds of things that they are familiar with without, again, diving into their own experience and putting it too close to home with their own feelings. Once again, check out that overview workshop on the Patreon membership, Kabalevsky and Friends. There's a lot of information in that workshop, and I had a really great time preparing it. Also, check out links to 3 other Kabalevsky pieces that I've covered on the YouTube channel, and I wish you all the best in your teaching and playing.